So let me just give you a preview of what we're going to build. So in the previous tutorial, we created the Django API. So we built the models and I've set up some data here. So we've got 2 quizzes available in this quiz. I've created some questions for one of the quizzes, the Django quiz. So that's all we have available here in the background in terms of the data that's in our API. So we're going to build in React a simple front end that's going to collect that data. So you can see the 2 quizzes here that we've created, collected the data from the API, and then we can go ahead. Now these are just random quizzes. Now in the previous tutorial, we built some endpoints for a random quiz facility or random quiz feature. So we're going to use that in this tutorial. Now we will build upon this throughout the series. So this is kind of like a baseline or initial build for our front end. So what we're going to be able to do in this tutorial is we're going to start a new quiz and just show that we're collecting individual questions related to that quiz. Now here we're going to be able to select, because questions might have multiple answers. So here you're going to be able to select more than one answer and press submit and then receive a reply. Now again, I'll show a baseline here of how to do that. You can go ahead and add to this and change things around how you want to, of course. Now the correct answer, once it's been selected, so you can see I can keep continuing my answer until I get the right answer, which is this one. And there we go. So then I can go to the next question, and this question actually looks like a question. So again, I can try and select the right answer and so on until I get the right answer, press submit, then I can select another random question. Now, obviously, I've only got 2 questions. You might have more questions in your quiz, but that's pretty much it. So at the moment, I'm not tracking the score or anything like that. This is just to kind of get a baseline and really just to showcase how to get data from your API rather than to focus on React. Now, I will be going over, and I will be building a framework for our application, which we can build upon. So like I said, we will build new things into this application as we go along throughout the series. So everything up here is just a placeholder. There's nothing working here. And these are just all placeholders down here. So nothing is working down there. Like I said, we'll fill those in later. And then in the next tutorial, I want to focus on the application process, the user registration and login process. So that would be the next tutorial in this series. And I know I've had a few requests in regards to setting up email confirmation and so on. So we'll go through that in the next tutorial. Okay, so let's get started building our React application. So I'm going to make an assumption that you've got Node.js installed because you're going to need some of those dependencies that come with that installation. So let's go ahead now and actually build. So npx and create React. So we're going to use the create React app. And then I'm going to call this app just core. So that's going to go ahead and download, install, and set up our application ready for us to start building. Okay, so that takes a couple of seconds to complete. So let's go ahead now and run the npm and start. That's just going to check to see if everything is working okay. So you can see here that by doing that, you'll notice that there is a problem. Because one thing that I seem to forget to do is also you need to then cd into the core. So everything is installed inside of this core folder. So the first thing you need to do is cd, move into the folder called core. And from there, you can then run npm start. Okay, so that's the first problem that you might receive, and that's solved. So once that's completed, you'll be presented with the default kind of React theme or view here. So we need to now go ahead and change this. So let's first of all just strip out all the things that we're not going to need. So the majority of all the files are going to be in the src folder here. So I'm just going to remove everything that I don't need. So I'm not going to need the logo here. And we're not going to use the report web vitals at the moment. We're bringing that back in later and all the tests, etc. So we can just get rid of all of those. So we're just going to leave the app.js. We don't need the index CSS at the moment. We can remake that later. So all we're left with is index, app, and app CSS. So what we can also do in the public, we can just remove some of these items if we want to, just to kind of clear everything up here. So that's what you're looking at initially when we loaded the React page. The manifest, we could change this if we wanted to, but yeah, let's just get rid of the icons for now. We can change the name, etc., but we'll just leave that as is. There's nothing in there I don't think we need to change. And then let's just remove the fav icon. We won't worry about that for now. So we'll just get rid of the fav icon there. So these are kind of optional things. You don't need to do this essentially, just to tidy things up maybe. We could change all these bits and bobs here, but okay. So that leaves us with a kind of a baseline here of index.js, the app.js, and the app CSS, which we can also delete. Let's just delete that too. There we go. Okay, so now we're ready. Index and app.js. So for anyone new starting with React and you're wondering what the hell is going on here, essentially, just to briefly describe what's going on here. When you load the React application, it's going to be loading up the index.html page here. So this is going to be connected to let's just say it's going to be connected to the index.js. That's kind of the entry point into our application. And you can see here that if we move down, we've got this this point here, or this connection here, reference to the app.js file. So essentially this file here is going to be placed in the middle here, which represents what's on the page. So that's how everything is kind of connected up at the moment. Index page loads the index.js, and the app component here is being loaded in the middle of the page. Okay, so let's think about a folder structure. So we're going to need a new folder. Let's call this components. So we've got our components folder. So we're going to place individual components in there so we can start to manage our application more effectively. So the idea is we create small components that we can bring into our application, small reusable components. So this is why we break our application into smaller components so that we can reuse these components in other places of your application. Plus it can make it easier to kind of manage your application. So let's get a new folder in here I'm going to call this folder framework. So inside of here is just going to be, for example, the header and footer that's going to appear on every single page. So I'll go ahead and make a new file called header.js, or make a new component, and then a footer. So those are two components that will appear on every single view that you see, the header and the footer. So the header is going to have the title, the footer is going to have the footer section that you saw in the preview. We're also going to build an API folder. So what I want to do here is kind of separate the API mechanics or the functionality away from the main application. So we can manage the API connectivity and bringing in the data within a different component. So we can then reuse that component throughout our application. So let's just create a new folder, and we're going to call this one, let's just call it API. Okay, so now we've got that in place. That's pretty much the folder structure for our application. So let's head over to the index page. We're just going to tidy up this section. So we don't have the CSS page anymore. So we can take that out. We don't have the vitals either. So we can remove that too from our application for now. There we go. So that's just kind of tidy that one up. If you head into the app.js file, now you did, when we looked at the server, when we run the server initially, you saw a lot of things on the page. So we can just tidy that up. So let's just go ahead and delete all this div here. So we don't need that anymore. Now we'll make a complaint here because we don't actually have anything inside of the return, which isn't a problem for now. If you're not familiar with React, when you return something, you're going to need an outer element and then add all your data inside of it, for example. So what you couldn't have is if you started building a pattern like this, for example, you can see that there's going to be an error because this isn't wrapped within one element. So there's a few ways of getting around that. So we can use the this type of pattern here and put some things in between, not a problem. Or we could use let's just bring in a component from React. So import React from React. So what we can do is use the React fragment, for example. So this allows us to kind of group a list of elements or elements without adding kind of any extra nodes. So this is going to allow us to have two divs instead of wrapping them up, for example. So from here, we can use React. This needs to be in brackets. So React.fragment. There we go. So we have a start and an end. Okay, so that's just a general fragment. And from within there, we can start to build our different elements. So one of the good features of utilizing Visual Studio Code is you can see that some of this text is kind of grayed out slightly, and that's suggesting that it's not being utilized within the application, and therefore we can remove it. So let's just go ahead and remove this SVG because we know we've deleted it anyway. And in addition to that, we don't need to import the CSS anymore because we're not using that. So that kind of strips the app. And I think now we've stripped out everything that we're going to need. We set up all the framework and we can now move on to actually building the application. So as I previously mentioned, the index page is going to be loaded up on the front end. That's going to load up the index page. And you can see that then we're bringing in this application, which we've imported in, and we're placing it this kind of component right here. And then it's going to display whatever's inside of this app component. So there's kind of a hierarchical structure here that we're developing. So let's just go ahead and just add a div here just to show that's the case. So let's just say hello. Oh, let's go for the hello world. Any excuse. There we go. So let's just load this up. So it's compiling at the moment. There seems to be an error. C blah, blah, compiling. Okay, we'll just close that. Okay, so let's just npm start this. Okay, so that's kind of loading up on my other page. Okay, so here it is. It just says hello world. So you can clearly see, hopefully now, what's happening. Like I've already mentioned, the index page contacting the index.js page, and then we've got that app page being loaded up, and that's what we're actually seeing on the page. So let's go ahead now and build our header page. So back in your folder structure here, have the header.js. So this component is going to be utilized to put on the top of our component or on the page so we can see a basic header. So for no particular reason, we're going to build our application with Material UI. And this is going to give us all the kind of visuals that we need to design our application. So down here on the left-hand side, we've got different components that we can bring in, boxes and containers, sliders, switches, app bars, etc. So if you go over to the app bar, you'll see a list of different options we have for the app bar. So we're going to just utilize one of these, copy some code in, and then utilize that as a placeholder for now. So now you can go ahead and actually npm I Material UI core. So that's going to install the main packages for the Material UI so that we can bring them into our project. So now we have Material UI available. All that we need to do at this point, I'm just going to npm start the application. So this is also going to give us some indication of anything that's not working, of course. So it's handy to have it open or on while we're actually building our application. So let's go over into our header, and now let's go ahead and start building. So let's start by setting out our application. So export default, for example, function, and then let's call this function header. And we're going to then need maybe a return here. So we're going to return some code that's going to structure or actually build or display the header on the page. Okay, so that's that done at this point. So we've exported, or we're able to export this header onto another component. So now let's start to think about what we're going to need here in order for us to utilize the Material UI. So in order to utilize Material UI, we don't bring it all in at once, the whole package. We bring in individual components. So we're going to need a few components as well as setting out some of the CSS. So we can write CSS within this page. What we need to do is just define the fact that we're going to do that with Material UI. So first of all, we're going to create this variable classes. That's going to equal use styles. So we're going to make this, this available here so that we can access our styles that we're going to create in a second. So this variable here brings in use styles from Material UI, but also it connects us to some CSS that we're going to build. So now what we can do is just define the space for that. So let's call this use styles equals make styles, and then say theme. Okay, so there's only going to be need one there. I think that's good. Okay, so in here, for example, now we can actually define some styles. So for example, root. So we want this to kind of flex, grow, 1. How about that? So that's just a simple way of setting out a style here. That should be okay. Now there's some code issues here. So let's have a comma there. So we're opening and closing, and then we've kind of missed a close. Okay, so now that's in place. We've essentially just connected or made available our use styles, our styles that we can then include within our application. So let's go ahead and actually bring in some of the other items that we're going to need. So we're going to need to actually bring in from Material UI make styles. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll go ahead and just copy that in. There we go. So that kind of connects that up nicely. Now, the reason why this is underlined is because we're not actually utilizing it yet in our application. So don't worry about that for now. So that kind of brings everything together there so we can create our own styles within our application. Okay. Let's go ahead now and set out a new framework for this. So this is going to be an outer element for our application. So you can see that here I brought in, let's just move this around. You can see here I brought in classes.root. So this is how I'm going to call my new classes that I've applied or I'm defining at the top here. Now, if you're not too familiar with Flex Grow, now Material UI is utilizing Flexbox, which allows us the tools to kind of manage the layout, alignment, sizes of grid columns, navigation components, etc. So Flex Grow is a built-in CSS functionality. So if you're not too sure how to use Flexbox, then just head over to kind of Flexbox or type in Flexbox into Google, have a look. But of course, you can go to the Material UI website, and then let's go over to here and just type in Flex Grow from the Flexbox area. Here it takes you through the different ways you can manage the dimensions and the structure of your page. So if you're not too sure what that is, just have a quick read of that. So we're using Flex Grow 1, which is going to provide us a kind of a fixed width column. Okay, so that's our first element in place. So now what we're going to build inside of here, remember this is kind of an outer container, is this is going to now be our app bar. So we're going to build an app bar. So this app bar is an element from Material UI. So because it is that, you're going to need to import this in. So if you go to the top, you'll just need to include that in so we can then have access to all of the items. So you can see, because I selected the option when I created it, you can see it automatically is imported for me. So let me just show you that again. So you can clearly see that happening. So if I type in app, you can see it says auto import from, and that will say obviously Material UI there. There we go. So you can see it's automatically being imported in when I need it. So now I've got my app bar. I can go ahead now and just consult the manual. So app bar. So from here you can see that I can just start to copy and paste some of this code out depending on what app bar I want. So there's a source here if you need more information or more code based upon what's happening here. You can have a look at the code. So go ahead and choose an app bar. We'll go ahead and just build our own app bar very quickly. So one of the details that you're going to find on the Material UI website are all the different attributes that you can apply. So here I'm going to have an app bar that's static. I'm going to use a default color, whatever the default color is for this app bar. I think it's blue. And then elevation. So here we can add some elevation, which is going to provide some sort of, if we, for example, take an example here, you can see that there's some gray elements here, which is it's kind of making it into a 3D effect. It looks like it's kind of elevating from the page. So we can define if we wanted that kind of elevation. So you can see, like I said, this gray section here, which is kind of providing a shadow from the bar, making it look like it's popping out of the page slightly. So that's a elevation. And then we give it a class name of classes.appbar so that we can add some additional styling here. So let's just add some additional styling if you need it. Of course, that's totally optional. Maybe you don't need that. So I haven't got any additional CSS here that I need, but that just shows you how to connect that up if you do need it. So in Material UI, we have different components within components. We have the app bar, which defines certain parameters. Here you've got the elevation, etc. So within our app bar, we then have other different components that we can include. So now we need to define a toolbar. So you can see I'm going to use the auto import again. And that's going to appear or not up the top here if it does need any imports. So the toolbar does need an import. So you can see, oh, sorry, it is imported. So you can see it here. So we've imported the toolbar. So that's all good. So this is going to provide us a toolbar. So we can now add some items within this toolbar. It's going to be a separate area within our app bar where we can add some different items. Now, typically within Material UI, if we want to utilize some text, we would utilize typography, which is going to then also provide us some additional options so we can manage our text, again, a little bit more efficiently. So here's typography. So again, I'm just going to import that in automatically here from Material UI. So we bring that component in, and now we can start to think about, well, this is going to be the name of my application. So here's kind of the heading or the name of my application is going to be called quizzes. So I can go ahead now and think about some of the different parameters that I might want to apply to that. Okay, so just to add some different parameters here, let's talk about variants. So here's just typical CSS variants, so H1 to H6. That's going to describe the size of my text. We're going to inherit the color from Material UI, whatever the default setting is. And then we're going to say no wrap. So this is going to be another flexbox attribute. So it doesn't wrap my text, but I'm only using one word, so that's not really relevant here. So let's just get rid of that. And then we can also add a class name again if we wanted to add some additional kind of options here. So let's just go ahead and set this up. So we're going to have toolbar title. We're going to use flex grow 1 again. That's just going to provide the scale for this. in different sizes of screens. So we're just going to say 1. Right. So now we have that in place. So that should be the heading. So let's go ahead now and just save that up. And I'm just going to import that in just to show that it's working. Now, if you head over to the app.js file, I've started to import this in. So let's remember the app file here is in the root directory, the src folder, and we want to get into the framework to access the header file. So in our app.js, I've started typing import header from, and now this is where I am and this is where I need to get to. So I need to start off in this folder, and then I need to go to components, and then I need to go to framework, and inside of framework is the header. There we go. So we've imported that component into this page, and now we can utilize it. So the way that we can utilize it is just by naming it. There we go. And that should bring that component into this page, or into this component, sorry. So it looks like it's working okay because we don't have any errors here. So let's just go back to our app here, refresh, and there we go. We now have this app bar. It says quizzes. It's slightly gray, you notice, and it's getting to where we need to get it to. But notice also we've got this this border around our page here. So this margin, sorry, is a default margin that our browser applies to our page. And if someone can tell me after many years of why the browsers do this, I'd love to know why this is the default option still. Because how many websites do you see where this is the default option? So yeah, we start with a margin around the page. So what we're going to need to do is just go back into our application and now just bring back in our CSS. So let's just bring in a new file here. Okay, so we're going to create an index.css. Let's bring it into our application. Sorry, I've made it into the wrong folder. And then inside of here, what we're going to do is just set out some simple CSS. So body and then margin. That's going to just be 0 pixels. So that's just going to remove that margin around our page. So obviously in the index page, I need to bring that back in again. So go into your index page, of course, and then you just need to import that in. So let's import index.css. So the dot is referring to this directory because the index page here and the CSS page is in the same directory structure. So let's just say dot. So this folder, look for a page or a component called index.css. Okay, so if we go back to our component here and refresh, we shouldn't need to refresh, but we refresh, and you can now see that that margin has been removed. Okay, so you've just brought in a component into another component so we can view that component. So you can hopefully start to see how now making smaller components, we can now import those or utilize those in other components to build up our page. So we're not going to be utilizing this app page to actually show anything. We're going to be utilizing this app page to kind of set up the rest of the application. So we're going to need to set up URLs so that we can navigate to different pages of our application. So now what we need to do is set up the router, the React router, so that we can navigate to separate pages. Right, so the first thing that we're going to need to do is actually bring the React router in. So let's go ahead and npm install that. So let's just close that and clear that. So npm install. And then we're going to install the React router DOM. Okay, so what we're going to do here is just configure the app file. We're going to configure the app component to direct the component to different components within our application. So this is going to make sense in a second. So let's just get rid of in our app here. Let's just get rid of these components here. We're not going to need those for now. And then that means we don't need to bring in React again. Okay, so what we're going to do here is just set out our router. So the router is basically going to describe what routes are available within our application, and those routes will refer to different components that we can access. So we're going to need a home page for this application, and we're going to need another, what I say, page or component to show the quiz, the actual quiz questions. So those are two different views that we need to set up, and those require two different paths within our system to access those components. So let's go ahead, and we brought in router. So we're going to need to define that in a minute. So let's just do that now. So let's just, well, we don't need this header anymore. So import, we're going to need the router. And that's going to be from the component that we've just installed. So from, that's going to be the React router DOM. There it is. Okay, so we bring in router. So now we can describe our links that we want to build. So let's go ahead and switch this up. There we go. So switch is going to provide us the ability to describe the different routes that we're going to have within our application here. So now we can go ahead and describe our routes. So these routes refer to individual components that we want to link to within our application. Because remember, we're building a single page application here. So we still want to be able to kind of link around to different views like we would do a normal web page. So we go to a web page, we click on the categories page, that takes us to the categories page. But of course, here we're using a single page application. So we're just going to need to build up our links here so we can access those different kind of components or those pages, as I might describe it. So our route here is going to describe a path. So that's going to be the path. So if someone goes to the main homepage, which is the root page here, we're going to then tell them which components they should see. So if we set up, for example, here a page called categories, then we then describe what components should be shown when we go to the categories page. And this path here represents what we type into the browser, into the URL, so /categories, etc. So here's the path, the home page for our application. And now we can just define the component that we want to associate that to. So this is going to be our landing page for our quiz. So this is going to be our quiz selection page, our home page for the quiz. I'm going to call that quiz select. So that is a component we haven't built just yet. So let's go ahead in components. Let's add a new file, and I'm going to call this file quiz select, or this component quiz select.js. So that's a new component that I'm going to build. So now I have that in place. Let's just go back to the app.js. I'm just going to close all these so we don't have too many open. So I'm in the app.js. So that's a quiz select component. Now I need to bring that component in, of course. So I just need to remember where I am. I'm in the root directory here. So I need to import, and we're going to say quiz select from, and that is going to be from, I'm in the component. So I need to go into the components directory, define that, and then it's going to be in there. So inside of there is a quiz select file. And there we go. So I've connected that up. So now what I'm saying in my application, when I open up the application, that's the root directory, it's actually going to show this component. That's what I'm doing. So here, hopefully you can start to see that this router is defining, when I define in my browser the URL or the path, it would then show the different components depending on the different paths that I type in or utilize within the browser. So what I can also do here, well, let's just do this first. So this is the home page now for our application. So let's go ahead now and just go into the quiz select file here, and let's just build something here just to show you the fact that when we run our application now, it's going to look for the path, and then it's going to look for the component and load that component, which is the quiz select component. So let's go ahead and start building this up. So let's build the export. This is going to be called quiz select, right? Select. So let's just do it this way. Okay, so we're going to need a return here. So we're going to return something eventually. So let's just build that in. Okay, so that's our quiz select. So what we're going to do here is just import the header. So we're going to need the header on this page, aren't we? So we just need to remember where this page is. So this is in the components, and we want to go into the components framework folder to get the header. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's import the header from, that's going to be the framework folder, and then I want the header. So here in Visual Studio Code, you can see it's prompting me in terms of what files are inside of those folders, which is handy. And so then I can go ahead and within this placement here, I can then bring in the header. There we go. Okay, so just to finish off, we export default quiz select. Okay, so that kind of finishes off that page there, the quiz select page. So let's just close that and start the application. So npm start, and then go back in to your application, and you should receive this error here, location of undefined. So if you go over to this post here, React router uncaught cannot read properly location of undefined. This is a really simple problem, which you might find. So simply because we're utilizing version 4 and not version 3 of the React router DOM, you can see that we're going to need to bring this in slightly differently here. So let's just go ahead and in our app.js file here, let's just bring that in separately. So the browser router as router. So let's just remove router from this list here. So we're bringing in root and switch from the React root DOM, and then browser router as router from React router DOM here also. I'll just buddy those up. So let's try that. Let's go back into our application and let's see if that works. And there we go. So there we have our new app started. So I do hope at this point you've got a general feel of what's happening here, of the structure of this application. We've got these components that we're building individually, and then we're bringing them into our application to build up our application. So we remember that we've got this index page here connected to our index page here. This is connecting to our app component, and our app component we're describing what other component to show based upon the root, which is the URL. So let's go ahead now and actually start to finish the quiz select, because what we need to do now is bring in the data from our Django API so that we can actually see some data on our React front end. So we want to be able to collect all the quizzes that are available within our quiz system and show them on the page so that users can select the quiz that they want to take. So I guess this is a two-step process. We need to collect data from our API, pass it over to the component so that then the component can then format it and display it on the front end or to the user. So because collecting data is very generic, we're going to make a separate component for this. So let's go ahead and into our API folder that we created earlier, and let's just call this API, shall we? Or connect, API connect. I'm just going to call this, let's connect API.js. There we go. So I'm going to call mine connect API.js. This is going to be a generic component which I can use for all of my other components when they need data from the API. So to help us build an API or collect data from APIs, we're going to utilize another package that's going to help us do that. So we're going to utilize Axios here in this application. So let's go ahead and just stop our server, and we'll go ahead and actually import Axios into our project. So this is simply the case of typing in npm I and then Axios. There we go. So that will bring in Axios into our application. This is an API facility that's going to allow us to easily connect to our Django API and collect data from it. So now that is done. Of course, you don't need to use this. There are other ways of doing this. So we have a kind of a default way inside of React if we wanted to use that. So we're going to use Axios. It provides some great tools and is easy to use. So let's go ahead and use that. So let's just close everything here. Let's go into our Connect API JS components. And the first thing that we need to do is to import Axios. So that just gives us access to all the tools that it provides. There we go. So let's go ahead and build this. So right, let's call this collect data. There we go. So we're going to call this collect data. Now, what we can do is we can pass in a URL. So because the collection of the data is going to be generic for all of our different components, so when we collect data, we're going to collect it in exactly the same way, except for one thing. Now, remember our API has an endpoint. That endpoint describes the data that we can collect. So if you remember in the previous tutorial, we created, I think it was 2 or 3 endpoints. One endpoint which collects all the data about the quiz. So we can then show all the quizzes that are available to the user. And then we also created an endpoint for a random question. So the process of collecting that data is the same, except for the URL will be different because we have different endpoints for different data that we want to collect. So we can just pass in that URL to collect data from that endpoint. Now, because we're using asynchronous connections here, that means that when we make a request, we may have to wait a couple of seconds for a reply, but we still want our application to go on and work, for example, or maybe to perform other activities. So to kind of indicate whether we're waiting or not, it'd be good to have some sort of indication, wouldn't it? So let's first of all, let's set up the facility so that we can actually determine whether we're waiting for data to be returned or not. So we're going to set up this storage here so that we can store whether we're actually fetching or not. So let's just set up this state. Is fetching. So we're going to set this to false to begin with. So what's going to happen here then is that when we make a request to the API, this is going to be set to true. So it is fetching. Once we've received the data from the API, we then set this to false. So what we can do on the screen in terms of the user is that when this is set to true, we are trying to fetch data, it would tell the user that we're trying to fetch data. When the data is returned, then that will disappear and actually then show the data. So this is kind of a crude method of doing this. So this would just be handy for us to explore later on, potentially setting up a more robust way of doing this. But this will work most definitely, but we won't actually set up many of the different visuals here. We'll just have a piece of text that will say data is being fetched, and I'll show you that working. So now we want to use a use effect. So if you're not familiar with React hooks, use effect is basically going to allow us to perform an action as soon as this component has been initiated. So what we're going to do here is we're actually going to, when this component is called, it's going to automatically initiate this code within here, which is obviously the fetching process, collecting the data from our API, right? That's what we want to do. Now, you notice that we're going to need to bring this in to our application. So let's just import that in. So we're going to also need the state as well, because we're using use state. So we're going to need to bring that in the same time. So use effect and use state. Now we know that we're using hooks, React hooks, because we're using the use. So that normally defines a hook, a React hook. So we're going to bring those two tools in because we're using them. And that's going to be from React. There we go. So let's just move this down. It's in the wrong place. There we go. Okay, so that's good to go at the moment. So we're going to store whether we fetched the data or not, and we're now going to configure the collection of the data. So we're going to be working within these curlies here. Ooh, we don't want to move that. So let's just move that there, provide a comma. Okay, so we'll define this, we'll describe this in a second. Okay, right. So the first thing we're going to do, let's just actually set up and create a request so we can send some data over. So let's just call this fetch data from API. So this is going to be an async. We're utilizing asynchronous kind of requests. So async, and then what we want to do now is we want to try collecting data from the database. So let's just give this a go. Right. So now we set this out, we're going to be using asynchronous kind of connectivities or requests here. So we want to now actually try and collect data from the API. So because we're trying to collect data from the API, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to change the state here to true because we are fetching. So let's just do that first. So we're going to need to use the set fetching. So let's go ahead and set fetching. So here what we're going to do now is just define the fact that we are going to now start fetching the data from the API. So we're going to set the data set fetching to true. So just to let everyone know that we are fetching data. So is fetching is now true. So remember here, this is how we're going to collect the data from this state, and this is how we're going to set data within the state. So this is why we're saying set fetching and then defining is fetching now to true. So now we want to actually get data from our API, right? So let's do that and store it in a response. So we're going to restore whatever data is returned from the database. So await Axios. So we're going to wait for Axios to return some data from our database. Now we want to now send across to Axios. So we're using Axios get, which is an Axios command. And then what we need to do is just pass in the details of our get request. So what we want to do is we want to tell Axios where to get the data from, and that's going to be from the URL. So what we're going to need to do now is just set up a data state for that. So let's go up the top here. So what's going to happen now, you can see, is that I'm going to pass in the URL to this function here, and we're going to save that into the kind of initial state, and then we can access that via API URL. So if we want to access this data here, we can just type in API URL here, API URL. So that's how we can get the URL. So what's going to happen eventually in our quiz select file is that we're going to define the URL to send across. That's going to then be passed in and saved into the state and then accessed via API URL. So that's going to now fire off a request to the API and then return the data into this variable response. So now we've collected that data, I guess it'd be a good time now to actually, well, do something with it, right? So let's now just create a new state so that we can save that data. Now it's going to be an array. So I'm just going to paste this in. So data state and set data state. So that's how we're going to collect the data. This is how we're going to set it. And then we're going to store it here as an array and defined as data. So we're going to access it through the data property here. So let's now set that up. So what we want to do is set the data state, and that's now going to include anything that's inside already, and then the data response. So this is going to be the response, and then what we need to do is the response is going to return. So we're going to send a request to Axios. Sorry, through Axios get, we're going to send a request to the URL, which is our Django endpoint. That's going to be saved in response, but to get the data from response, we need to just drill down to response to the data. So that's then going to collect the data and put it into our state here. So now we've saved all the data from our endpoint, our Django API endpoint, and we can now access it via data state if we want to. So that's our try. So what we want to do is just probably catch any errors. So let's just finish that off, and let's just catch any errors. So if there is an error, well, we need to definitely set fetching to true, because we are still fetching, remember. So let's go ahead and see what's inside of fetch, and then is fetching. We're going to change to true. Yep, okay. So if there is an error, we can't find any data, then obviously fetching should be set to true, because we are still trying to collect that data, right? Okay, so that sets that out. So we've got this catch here. Obviously we could console log some of these errors and so on. So we'd expand the error a little bit more if you wanted to. So what we need to do now, I guess, is just make sure that that's complete. Okay. And let's go ahead now and run it. So we've called it fetch data from API. Okay. So that's going to then fire that off. Okay. So the last thing we want to do here, just remove that. Last thing that we want to do here is we want to actually return something, right? So we've collected the data. We've just done that. So let's go ahead and return. And this time we're going to return the data state. Remember, if we have received data, it's going to be stored inside the data. It's going to be set via set data state. And now we want to access it. So this whole process has collected data from our API. So what we want to do is return the data state. And then let's just export default. And that's going to be called whatever we call this here. So collect data. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So get over to the quiz select.js file. Let's go ahead and import our file first. So we just need to remember where that is. So we're in quiz select and we want to get to the folder. So in components, we want to get to the folder called API inside of that connect apps. So we need to, here in this framework folder, we need to come out one, it looks like. So we need to come out of the components folder, .. That takes us back a step. That takes us into the root directory. Then we can go into the API and then utilize that component. So I import that in, and then I go ahead and just create this variable here. So I'm just going to call this API URL. This is the endpoint where I want to collect the data. So that's, remember, that's the variable, or that's the data that I want to pass across to my connect. So then I can go ahead and actually get the data and then use that URL right here. So it gets passed across into this state here, and then we can utilize it. So you can start to see how generic this is, because I can just pass any URL across now and look to see if I can get some data. So I bring that in to this component and I set up my URL, and now I can actually then go and request the data. So I say connect API, that's the function, so the component we just made. So we send that data across there, and then it runs this piece of code here to check to see if we can get some data. The use effect kicks in, and then we return that data inside of the data state, and then I've just run this console log data state just to show that we've returned some data. So let's go ahead now and just npm start. Your server should run up, and then let's just go back to the right page. Here we go. So I refresh this page. Now that should have run all of that code and actually now return some data from our API. So let's just go into the console here, and let's just go into the object. You can see it's returned 2 items, and that's 0 and 1. And those are the 2 quizzes that we have inside of our Django API here. So let's just go over to our quizzes. You can see we've got 2 items here. Okay, so that's the only data that we returned, or that's the data that we've returned from our database. So obviously what we can now do is just build some front end to display those 2 items. Now, before we do that, we need to go back into the Django application. So head back into the Django application. In order for us to actually get that working, I've already gone the step further just to show that information's working. But what you're going to need to do next inside of Django is to install the core headers. So in order for us to actually make a connection or to accept connections outside of our maybe development network, we're going to need to install core headers. So let's just go into our core and settings, and you can see that I've already installed core headers. So go ahead and install Django pip install core headers. If you're not too sure how to do that, this is it here. So pip install Django core headers. So just run that. You'll notice that my application is running 3.5.0. That's the latest version as of recording this tutorial. So once you've gone ahead and installed that, go ahead and go into the core, in your core settings, add it to the installed apps. And then what you need to do is just a few different configurations. If you move down to the bottom here, you can see there's 2 configurations I've set up. The core allowed origins. So you can see I've allowed the React origin, which is running on localhost 3000 port. And I've also just put in cores allow all origins true. So it's kind of irrelevant at the moment, that data, but we just set it up so that we can accept external connections and actually connect to our API via React. So yes, once you've done that, you can definitely then go back into your application, refresh, and it should be collecting that data from our Django API. Okay, so now I guess what we need to do is go back into our React application and actually do something with this data. So let's just go ahead and kind of finish off building our application. So we've got this header in. So let's go ahead and actually sort out this footer. So I've already described to you the kind of framework that Material UI utilizes in terms of the styles, or importing the styles and then having to import the individual components for each part of what it is you're building. So with the footer, I won't go through anything amazingly detailed, but if I just bring this in here, so if you go over to Material UI and then head over to the Get Started and then Templates, that's going to give you some basic templates to help you get started. And what I'm doing here is, you'll notice that my final output looks a little bit like this, and I'm utilizing the footer for this application. So that's what I've done. I basically just I've copied this code here, have a look at the source code, and I'm just utilizing this as a placeholder for now. So if you go into pricing.js, it gives you all the components to build up the whole page. I've basically gone to the bottom from footer and started to utilize the footer. So I've kind of retrofitted it into this page here. So just to give you an overview of what's happening, if you're not still too familiar from what I previously mentioned, you can see that I've imported make styles to allow me to utilize my custom CSS or custom style here, sorry, typography. So that's where I'm kind of configuring text to be displayed in a certain way. I'm utilizing links here. So I've got links from Material UI, I've got a box, a grid, and container. So that's what's being imported in. This is the styles that we're utilizing. Like I said, I have just copied this across, so I haven't actually styled this myself. So we've got this function here for this component that brings into the footer, that comes into the footer, called copyright. So you can see this is kind of a function that we can import into our page here. So at the bottom here, we've got copyright. So you can see where that is being brought in inside of this box here. There's not too much to say other than that. Just have a look through the code. It's in the repository. We've got a container, and inside of the container is a grid. So this grid will define, so we've got spacing of 4, justify space evenly. So here we're basically just building a grid, 4 blocks across, so we can actually then go ahead and build what we're doing down here. So the grid down here, for example. And then inside of here, we've got this list. So inside of the list, notice what's happening here is that the data that's inside of my list is inside of this variable here. And you can see how it's been kind of detailed out and then it's been mapped out. So it's not been, yeah, it's been mapped out via the data here or the text that you see on the screen. Okay, so I do apologize for not going through this step by step. I didn't want to go through that. Just kind of try and concentrate because this is getting rather long now, this tutorial. So like I said, have a look in the tutorial repository for this code, just copy and paste it in and just have a look around and just familiarize yourself if you want to, Material UI or these different components here. So now that's ready, we can now go into the quiz select and just bring it in like we did the header. So now we can bring in the footer. Obviously, I need to import that in footer and underneath the header here. Let's just do the same thing again. So footer, and this time it's going to be the footer. There we go. So when we go back into our page, hopefully, if I open up the right window, hopefully now we refresh, you can see it's already there. So now we have our header and our footer. So this is what our quiz select page now looks like. We've brought in our header and our footer. So obviously now what we need to do is, well, put something in between there, right? So we're going to need the actual data. So again, similar to what you've seen here in this template, you'll notice that I am using this template. We've got the header brought in the footer. This is from Material UI template. We're now going to add the individual quizzes in as well as this box here. So let's go ahead and just finish off this quiz select. So the first thing we're going to need to do is bring in some of the Material UI components that we're going to need. So let me do that first. There we go. So this is all the components that we're going to utilize from the Material UI. Let's just put that at the top. Okay. So that brings in all the imports that we're going to need. So next up, just the styles. So some custom styles that we're going to be utilizing here. So I'll bring those in next. That goes before this export here. So let's go ahead and do that. There we go. So again, this is a lot of code I just don't want to explain in this tutorial. So have a look through the code. If you're familiar to CSS, it's going to make sense. So we've got this unordered list here, margin padding list style. We've got an at bar. I've added a bottom border of 1 pixel. So the toolbar is going to be a wrap. So it's going to wrap nicely as the page gets smaller. Everything's going to wrap, so things are going to start to pile on top of each other. We've got a toolbar flex 1, a link. So I've added some padding on the links. We've got a card header. So we just added the palette colors, etc. for that. And then we've also got this card pricing, which is going to be where the quizzes are going to be displayed. And we've got this displayed as flex, which means that they're going to pile on top of each other as the screen gets smaller. And there's a margin at the bottom. Okay, so there's just some custom CSS or custom styling that we're going to utilize for this page. So next up, let's just make sure that we've imported in the classes. So we'll go ahead and do that. So in the export here, let's just tab this. We'll just leave it like that. So we'll just bring in the classes so that we can utilize our custom styling here. And of course, use styles has already been imported up here. Also make styles, sorry, has been imported up here from the material UI. So we can utilize these custom components or styles. So next up, let's just remove the data state console log. So we don't need to print that out anymore. We know that we're collecting the right data. It's being stored in data state. So that's all good. And let's just go ahead and return. Let's just use our fragments here. There we go. Okay, so that's kind of sets up our fragments. I've used the wrong side. There we go. And then, of course, we just need to bring in React because we're utilizing the React fragment. Okay, so that just kind of brings that in. So that's our fragment. So we've got our header and our footer. And now what we're going to do is just define a container. So let's go ahead and after the header, we've got a nice container. It has to be a capital. Okay. So now we've got a nice container. So that's going to contain everything. And you can see here the max width is MD. So similar to, for example, Bootstrap, where we define the different sizes. So MD, if I just put something here, for example, if we just view that on the page, you can see that MD is going to be right here. So we know that our box or our container is going to be from there to there, for example. So if I were to change MD to LG, a larger version, that's obviously going to make the container much larger. So you can see the boundary starts here to there, for example. So that's just defining the width, excuse me, the width. What were these screens? The width of my container. Okay, so that's just the container. It's going to contain everything, right? So inside of here, we're going to create a grid. So let me just sort that out. So I've gone ahead and made this grid here. Now I've made the container spacing of 5 and alignment items flex end. So again, I'm just using Flexbox to align the items. And now I'm going to make a map. So what I want to do now, of all the data that's inside of our data state, remember that's the data that's returned from our API, which is only holding 2 things. That's the 2 quizzes, the names or the titles of the 2 quizzes right at the moment. So I basically just want to map those out. And as I loop through that data, essentially this map is going to loop through that data. As I loop it out, I want to make a new kind of container for that individual quiz. So what I'm going to do is then create this grid. So I'm going to create this new grid inside. The item key is going to be the title. And you can use, I'm using extra small and MD. So I'm defining the sizes of the boxes at different screen sizes. So at extra small, it's going to take up the whole width of the screen. And at MD, it's going to take up 4. So that defines the small items that I'm going to have inside of this grid, the sizes. So now I just need to detail what is actually going to be in these little boxes on the screen. So I'm going to build something called cards. I'm going to use the card component from Material UI. So let's go ahead and fill this in. So the card will have a card header. So I set out the card header. It's going to have a title. Now notice here that each time we map through every item inside the data that we return from the API, we're going to refer to it as Q. So I'm going to output the title. Now, how do I get the title? Well, when we return data from our API, that title is going to have like a a name value type of pairing. So all I need to do is get the name of the data that I want, in this case, the title, and then extract it out. So here I'm utilizing some other properties, align center. Align center is a different kind of typography properties. And then I've given this a class name of card header, which is then linked into my card header CSS or card header theming up here. Okay, so that goes towards the card header. And then we've got some card content. So this card content, you can see it starts and ends there. So what we're doing here, we're going to use some custom styling. We're going to use some text here. It's going to be called random quiz. And I'm going to use a typography element here so I can kind of set out some of the other styling properties. So that's going to say random quiz. Underneath that, there's going to be a list. And you can see here, it's just going to say 50 questions. So what I could do is, at the moment, my API is only returning the name of the quiz, but I could change that API to return more data, and I could just kind of output it here if I wanted to. So I've just kind of statically put 50 questions. There might be only 2 or 10 or 20, but that's the unordered list that we're going to create. And then we're going to have some actions. So at the bottom of my card, there's going to be an action. So that action is there's going to be a button. So I'll create a button, set out some of the principles, and you can see that I've at the moment, for this tutorial, I've just statically put in the URL, which is going to take me to the other component, which we haven't set up yet. So this is going to take me to the Django random quiz. So obviously, again, what we're going to need to do is extract information from the API to return the right thing. So what we could actually do here, instead of using the word Django, notice how we get the data. So we could, for example, get the title, because we could use the title as part of the URL, but we're not going to go do that at the moment. That isn't really a problem at this point. So we're just going to put that in like that. So we're going to have a button that's going to take us to that page that we haven't built yet. And there we go. So that's building a simple grid. So if I save that and go into my component here and refresh, I'm not too sure if I've turned the server on. Just to double check. So that should be pretty much all that we need. Let's just see if this is working. So it looks like there's a problem here. Okay. So this was a problem I saw earlier, but it did work previously. But obviously it's causing the problem now. So what's happening here? Our Connect API JS, really what we've done here is we've created our own hook. So we ought to be kind of naming the hook with use. So this was called collect data. So if we just rename this to use collect data, and then down here we just use collect data, you'll notice that the problem disappears because we've got a hook here. So we've now defined our own React hook. And let's go back. And you can now see we've got our quizzes. So if I select here, that's going to take us to this new URL, which we need to configure shortly to show all the quiz data. Okay, so we now have our boxes in place to show all the quizzes, and we've only got 2 quizzes in our data, in our Django administration. So if we were to add a new quiz, let's just test this out. Let's just call this JS. We need to make another category in a minute. So let's just press save. So we've now done that. And let's go back to our application and refresh. There we go. So we now can see that our React application is taking data from our Django API nicely. So let's just see what happens when we make another one, because this should wrap. So let's go ahead and make a new quiz. Let's just call this view. Press save. So we should now see a wrapping in place. And there we go. So you can see what's happening now. If we make more quizzes, it's going to be wrapped nicely like that. So next thing, let's just add in an item above this, as you saw in the preview. So let's just go back into our code. Now, let's just close everything up. We'll go into our quiz select. Now above here in our container, we've got our grid there. That's the grid we were just looking at. So let's go ahead now and just add something above this grid, which is going to be just some sort of kind of placeholder. So let's build another container. So I think this is going to be called a hero unit in terms of material UI. So I'm just going to paste this in. Okay, so here we go. So we built another container. Now, let's just get this right. Excuse me. So we've got this container. So apologies. So we're going to put it above this container here, in actual fact. So we're going to make another container for this. So this is the same type of setup, max width. You can see it's smaller. So the max width is going to be smaller. And we're utilizing the hero content style, which we defined here. So just some padding. And you can see what's happening here is we've got some typography. It's just going to be quizzes. And below that, we've got some more typography, which is this text here. So we've simply just built this simple container right there with some typography elements and a container element. So let's go ahead and see what we've done there. And there we go. So now we have this component up the top here. Notice that the width is smaller. So here we had an MD container. Here we've got a small container that just controls the size of this text. And there we go. So we now have an interface for our application, our quiz application. So now we can go ahead and focus on actually clicking on this item here. This is going to take us to a new quiz, which is going to be the Django quiz. So we now need to first of all set out our router and then attach that to a new component. And then we need to then configure that component to show the quiz and then just to bring in all the logic of the quiz so we can actually take the quiz and show the user whether they've selected the right or wrong answer. So now we know what the URL is going to be. Let's go ahead and close this and just put that down now for now. Okay, so what we're going to need to do, go into our app.js. We're going to need a new route, right? So we've got the connect API. So let's make a new file here. We're going to call this quiz, or should we call this a random quiz? How about that? Random quiz. Okay, .js. Right, so it's called random quiz. So let's go back into our app. Let's just copy this. We're going to make a new route. So this time the route's going to be R for random. And now what we need to do is add something here, because what's going to happen here is that when we travel here, we're going to need to tell our API, our Django API, that we want all the questions, or we want a random question from the Django quiz. So how are we going to tell dynamically the Django that we're going to need a question from the Django quiz is we're going to extract this component here. So this could be Django, this could be React or whatever. So we're going to take this, this piece of text here, this component here, and we're going to utilize this as part of the URL string request that we're going to send to our Django API. And by doing that, that's going to select the individual components from, or the individual question from our API. So let's just go into our API. Let's go to URLs. So you can see here that we're going to, let's go into, so we've got a quiz in our URLs. Now let's just go into our quiz, into our URLs. So you can see here, this is what we set up on Django. So what we needed to do to get the data about to get a random question from a particular topic, we needed we need to change that to R. So the path is going to be R, and then that's going to then collect this random string that we're going to send across. So that's what we need. In Django terms, apologies, I'm stumbling there, but you can see what's happening. When we actually get this data from our Django API, we're going to need to send this path. So we're going to need to send r/ and then the name of the topic. Remember, that's the name of the quiz. So we're selecting the quiz via name. We're going to get all that, all the questions from that quiz, and then we're going to select one of them and return only one question. So we need to kind of align that up. So what we're going to do here in our React application is we're going to pass that data over to our component to utilize to build that URL so we can send that specific URL over to Django. So this is where we bring in a new item. So what we're going to do here is we're going to utilize this format. So we're going to say topic. So this is going to allow us to set up essentially a variable, if you like, that when we send this across over to or when we utilize this in our component, we're going to be able to extract this information here. So we'll see that in a second. So we're going to extract this information right here. So let's go ahead and now import our new component in. Let's do this first. So this is going to be random quiz. So let's import this in. There we go. Okay, so now we've imported this component in. You can see that this path is going to take us to this component. Right, so now what we're going to do is, now we've got the component path, let's go over to our random quiz. So in here, we're going to, first of all, just set out the export. Okay, so export, we're going to call this random quiz. Okay, so that just sets out our random quiz. Now, what we want to do is collect that data from our URL. So when we type in, for example, Django here, we want to collect that word. So how we can do that is really very simple. We're going to use the use params. So let's just go ahead and import use params from the React router DOM. And now what we need to do a bit further down is just basically collect that data. So first thing we can do is set up this variable here where we collect the parameters that are called topic. Now remember, we've named this topic here, so we're going to collect those parameters. So what we can do then is just console.log, and then we can check to see if that exists or not, or whether we're utilizing it. So it's a fairly simple process doing it that way. So let me just type in topic here. Let's just go back to our application. Refresh. Okay, cannot resolve random quiz components. Failed to compile. So maybe there's an issue here. So we called it random quiz from random quiz. So let's just double check. I think I've put it into the wrong folder. That's why it's not working. So let's just move it out. Let's put it into here. I think I've just had it in the wrong folder. So now it should be picked up. There we go. Okay, so let's just make sure that everything is on. Doesn't contain a default export. Okay, so let's just set up that. So I've just added the export default random quiz. Let's just go back into our page, refresh. We do receive an error because there's nothing rendered. But you can see at the top here it says Django. Okay, so that's where we were outputting. So if I change it to React, you can see at the top here it now says React. So you can clearly see that we were collecting our parameters from the URL in topic and just outputting them. That's what I wanted to show you to begin with. So you can clearly see, hopefully now, the fact that if you want to pass over parameters through the URL here, we can just use params and collect that information. So that's going to be useful when we actually build the request for the data. Okay, so let's go ahead and just build this out. So what we're going to need to do is obviously bring in some material UI things. We're going to need the header and the footer, for example, as well. So let's just go ahead and set out some of this. So we'll start with the return. Just so we've got something for now. Okay, so that we shouldn't have any errors now. Okay, so that just sets that out. So we've got a blank page to work from now. Next thing, I guess we should just kind of test out to see if we can get the right data from the database. So let's go ahead and set that out. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is connect or import in our Connect API hook so that we can actually send requests to the server. And then what we've done there is, like we did previously, this is why I've pre-typed it out, because we're just following the same path as we've previously done, where we set out the URL. So here what we're going to do is send a request to quiz/r plus the topic name. So the topic name is going to be added to that URL there, whether it's Django or whatever. And then you can see what we've done is we return that data. So we've sent that, we've made a request now. We've passed over that URL over to our Connect API hook. We've received the data and we're just going to console log that out. So again, I pre-typed this out because we've already done this before in the previous. We're just using a different URL this time. Now, just remember the URL pattern is right here in Django in the quiz URL. So we need r/ and then a topic. Also remember that in the core, we defined the URL to be quiz/. So it's quiz/ and then r and then the random or the topic name. So that's how we've set out our URLs. So r string topic. So let's go back into our application. So that's the right URL that we're sending the request to, plus the topic. Okay, so let's go back into our page and let's just refresh. So we're using our Django and it's actually returning some data. So there we go. So we can see the data has been returned. It's just one question that's been returned. This is what we set out in the previous tutorial. We're returning all the answers and whether they're right or not, and then also the title. So that's all the data that we're returning about that individual question at the moment. Of course, you can change and add to that if you wish. Right, so we're receiving the data, which means that all we need to do now, of course, is to output it onto the screen and deal with it as a quiz. Now, if I were to type in React, no data is being returned because we don't actually have any questions inside of our React quiz. That's the problem. We've only got questions so far inside of our Django quiz. So that's why we're just using Django quiz at the moment. So if I go into quiz and questions, you can see we've got 2 questions in there. So it's just randomly picking one of those. So you can see it's picked. Let's just do that again. So it's randomly picked one of those questions. This time it's picked question 2. So I guess that's the easy bit. So now what we need to do is to actually display it and sort out all the logic for this quiz. So this is kind of a stopping point for those people who don't really want to go ahead and actually do this. You can now see we've built this framework application so that we can now build any other component here. We can add components here. We can continue utilizing our Connect API and just send it new URL endpoints for Django. So now what you can do in Django is go ahead and build some more API endpoints and then just build some more components, change the URL that we send across to our Connect API, and you'll collect different data based upon the endpoint that you've specified. So if we were to remove quiz select and random quiz, and then just reconfigure our app, with new URLs, you can see that everything else now is kind of like a baseline that you can build from. So you could probably save this now. And if you're going to make another API for another project, you could maybe just bring this in and then obviously just build out the different components. So we've got this hook that we can utilize for all of our different components. So let's go ahead now and actually build this out. Okay, so I'm going to import some of the material APIs that we're going to need. Oh, sorry. First of all, let's just go and get the header and footer right. Let's just spell that out first. So we can just go to the previous app here, the quiz select app here, and we can just kind of import this in. So we need the header and the footer. So let's just go ahead and import that in. And same kind of procedure again. We've got the header and then the footer. There we go. So now that should be the header and footer sorted on this page. Yep. So now we've got the header and footer. Right. So let's just turn this into a React fragment. Okay, for no particular reason, I could just wrap this up, of course. Okay, so then obviously I need to import React. Okay, so now that works. And now we can actually then build the question set. So I'm going to be utilizing multiple material UI elements. So let's just bring those in. There we go. So not too dissimilar to what we've already done. I'm going to be utilizing alerts to show the user whether they've actually answered the question correctly or not. So we'll utilize those components. Everything else is pretty much the same. You can see we're going to import some styles. Checkbox. So we're going to be utilizing checkboxes. So I brought in those components. We're going to be utilizing some links. Yeah, so just some stuff that we're going to be utilizing now. One thing that you're going to need to do next, if I just close this server, is we're just going to need to import the lab here. So that's something that you're going to need to do. So as well as we're going to be utilizing some icons, I think we are potentially. So just go ahead and first of all, npm install material UI icons. So that's going to allow us to use the icons. And then in addition to that, we'll also install the UI lab, which is going to give us access here to the alert and alert title. So let's go ahead and do that. So once we've got all those dependencies ready, we can now think about how this is going to look on the page. So I just copy and paste in the styles that we're going to be utilizing. So just under here. So we've got some styles that we're going to be utilizing. Nothing crazy here. If you're familiar to CSS, again, we've just got width, margins and colors and display flex, padding and margins at the top, etc. So because I'm utilizing that, of course, I just need to be able to bring that in to my project. So in the export, just below there, I'm going to bring in the classes so I can utilize them within my application. Like I said previously, this basically just allows us to connect to these styles here. So the first thing we're going to need to do is just extract the answers from the question so that we can then eventually compare the answers to the user's answers. So we're going to need to perform that action. Now notice here we're utilizing an array. It's an indexed array, 0. And then we have the answers here and also the titles. And you see the answer here has an array of answers. So we're going to need to just extract that out from this array. So let's go ahead and do that first. Let's store it in A equals, so in data set, notice that the data is in data. So you can see that it's referred to as data. So that's how we can access the information inside of here. So inside of there, we want to just basically, we're going to say flat map, sorry, data.flat map. So because we're utilizing indexed array, we just want to ensure that we return an array rather than an indexed array, just to make things a little bit easier to work with. So Q, and then basically we're just going to loop through and find all the questions, or sorry, the answers. I keep saying questions, the answers. So we're going to loop through and find all the answers, referred to as answer. Okay, so we got that out. So that's going to return all the answers. So if we were now just to console log that, that should just return an array of answers. There we go. So now we've just got the answers. Good. So we're going to want to, in this case, this approach, I'm just going to count them. So I'm going to create another variable here called AC for answer count. And that's going to equal, well, we're returning A. So we just need to use a length. That's going to basically count how many items are returned, or how many answers there might be. Of course, your questions might have multiple answers, 6 or 7 or 8 answers. So we return that. So that'd be AC. So let's just see that in action. There we go. So we're returning, there's 3 possible answers. Okay, so let's go ahead and down the bottom here, let's just start to map out what it's going to actually, how we're actually going to display the quiz questions. We'll come back to this information up here in a minute. So we're going to need a container set to extra small. That's going to contain our question in the center. And then we're going to just create this paper here. Again, just as another container around our question. So now we want to actually loop out, or we want to actually display the answer. So here we take the data state.data map. This is going to provide us a loop to loop around the data that's been returned from the API. We're selecting the 2 pieces of information, title and answer, and we've got I here. That's going to represent the index. So let's go ahead. There's only one item here, so the key is going to equal, for example, 0 or 1. So we've got a nice little index there. And then we're going to set out a typography, which is obviously the text information. So we're going to component a H1 component. We're going to give it a variant of H5. So this is going to be a H1 component, but we're going to size it as H5, so it's not so big, the actual text. So there's the title. So we've extracted the title from the data that's returned from our API. We put it right there. Now we need to go ahead and actually loop out the answers. So we're going to take in the answer text and then an ID. Now the ID is the ID of the question. This is important. So when we build questions in Django, obviously those questions are individual pieces of information that goes into the Django. I might as well just quickly show you. In Django, so if I go into the database here, this is in Django. I just open up the questions, the answers, wherever the answers are. There we go. So just show you this table. You can see that every answer has an ID. So that's pretty useful, most definitely. So the question also has an ID. So let me just show you this. So the question also has an ID, which is also useful information, because what we can do later on is, once we've actually determined what the user has actually selected, we can also send that data back to the Django API, and we can create a new table where we record all the answers that the user has made. So if they do make the wrong selection, what we can do later on is that the user can review their answers and to see what answers they got incorrect, etc. So it's handy having this kind of ID to perform those type of actions. So anyway, we're then going to map out the answers. So what we do is we'll make a radio group. That's going to create the radio buttons, the little buttons we can press. And you can see here we've got the form control label and we've got the control details. So here we've got checkbox. So we're going to create a checkbox, and I'm going to handle that checkbox with the handle change function that we're going to build. So every time someone selects one of those checkboxes, it's going to fire off this function to handle that change and to save it in state. That'll come clearer shortly. And we've got a label here, which is just going to be the answer text. So all we've got here really is we're just extracting out the ID of the answer and the answer text. And that's what we're placing right here in the checkbox and then also in the label. So that pretty much spells it out. We've got a radio group, we've got a form control label, and then we've got a checkbox where you can actually select buttons, and that's connected to a function. So when you select it, something will happen, or we'll update the information that the user has selected, which question the user has selected, and then we've got the label, which is the answer text. Okay, so hopefully if the server's on, handle change hasn't been defined. So we'll just remove that for now, just to get this working. And we'll go back, and there we go. So we now have the actual question set. So if I refresh, remember this is selecting a random question. So if I just refresh the page, it will select random questions from Django API. Now, obviously there's only 2 questions. That's why we're only seeing 2 questions. Okay, so now we've got these select options. We can now go ahead. We're obviously going to need a submit button. So we'll quickly add that in. So this button is going to go underneath. Let's just check to see where we are. So we've got the loop. So we don't want it to be within the loop. That's where the data state, or we do want it in the main loop. We don't want it in this loop here in actual fact. So let's go ahead now and just add a new button here. So that button, like I said, is just going to be utilized and pressed. And obviously what's going to happen here is when someone presses this button, these are all the properties, they're going to basically, we're going to fire off this new function called check answer. So when someone presses that button, we'll fire off a new function. So it's just going to be called submit answer. So let's have a look. There we go, submit answer. So that's that all in. Okay, so that pretty much sums up what we're going to do here in terms of the visuals for this page. The only thing that we're going to add, obviously when they submit, a new box will appear under here telling them whether they've got it right or wrong. Okay, so now what we need to do is be able to record when someone has actually made a selection. So let's work this out. So what we want to do is create a function so that when someone presses the checkbox, we're going to fire off a new function, and we're going to call that handle change. So let's call that handle selection. Handle selection, or maybe user selection. Okay, so we're going to call that handle selection. So this is on change. So as soon as someone presses one of those radio buttons, obviously it's not connected, it's not working at the moment. As soon as someone selects one of those, it's going to then fire off this function here called handle selection. So what we need to do now is just build a new function. So let's just move those up. So we're going to call this obviously handle selection. So let's do this. Handle selection. So we're going to first of all, we want to basically save their selection. That's all we're going to do. So set answer. Well, let's selection, shall we? Let's go set selection. So this is a data store that we're going to need to set up, and we're going to basically selection. I feel as though I need to call this answer, set answer. So let's just call this answer. So we're basically going to update, we're going to read whatever's inside of answer to begin with. Sorry. And then what we're going to then do is basically get the target, which is what the user has selected. So we're going to get the target value. That's what the user has selected. And then basically yeah, we want to select what's been checked. So what we're going to do here, let's just kind of summarize this, is that we're going to build a new state. So let's just quickly build this new state. So it's called set answer. So just here then. So we've got answer and set answer. So inside of here starts off with absolutely nothing at all. Right. As soon as the user presses one of those buttons, one of those options to select an answer, what's going to happen, we're going to get all the data from answer. So ... that's going to allow us to kind of list out all the answers. We're then going to basically update the answer with the item that's been checked. So what's going to happen if the user was to select an item, that would appear here in the answer state. If we were to reselect, what will happen is because we're selecting the target value, that's the, if we go down here to the labels, we're setting the value to ID. Now, because we're utilizing the ID, it means we can override what's already in the state. So this way we can record whether the user has selected or deselected every radio button. So every radio button that the user can select will have a value ID. So we use that value ID to check whether that's been set already. If it has been set, then we just override it with the new selection. And that's going to be true or false. So it starts off with false. If we select a radio button, that will then be true. So we get all the answers that have been made already. If the user's made any answers, we then find if there has been, the answer has already been made or selected, and then we update it, whether it's true or false. So that's what we're doing there. We're going to save it then inside of this state. Okay, so obviously we're going to need to import use state. So let's go ahead and do that. So from React, let's just bring that in. So that was a use state. Okay, so we've now got that saved. So let's go ahead and actually see that in action. So if I console.log now that, and that's just going to be answer. So if I console log that, so that should now record the answer, or it should output the answer. So let's just go into our console, select that. Notice it now says 1 true. If I select this, it's now 1 and 2 true. And then if I select the last one, we now have 1 true, 2 true, and 3 true. Now if I deselect other, it goes to false, and then so on. So here you can clearly see a mapping of the answers that the user is provided. Now, one annoying thing here is if I just refresh the page, if I just select one item, there's only one item here, and that can make it harder to actually compare against the actual answers. So particularly if you, for example, have 2 answers that are correct. So what we can do is we can set out in the state some initial answers. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to build a function which when the page loads, it works out how many answers there are and then sets out or defines a kind of an initial set of answers inside of the answer state. So let's just have a look to see how this works. So let's go ahead and first of all, we're going to create this new variable. Oh, sorry, this new function called create initial answers. And then inside of here, what we're going to do is we're going to use flat map again to flatten, in this case, let z equals a. So remember a, we returned a earlier. So we got all the answers from our question and we put it into a. That's what we did originally. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those answers. They are indexed. So we use flat map. And then what we're going to do is just select the ID of those questions. Now, this is important because remember that we're returning these questions here. We're using the ID inside the question. So notice that it's 4, 5, and 6 here in this question. If I go to question 1, the questions are numbered 1, 2, and 3. So it's important if I'm going to make a match between the user's answers and the actual answers, I need to match the actual question number to the answer. And that's important also because if you're, for example, randomizing the actual answers on the page here, we can still make a comparison between the user's answers and the actual answers utilizing the ID of the question. So that's important to keep there. So we get the IDs of the questions. Remember, we're getting the questions here initially up here. So we do that. So that Z is now storing the answer IDs 1, 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6. So next up, what we do is we're going to create this new object here, and we're going to loop through AC. So AC was the length here. So what we're saying here is that we're going to build 3 new objects. Now we know how many objects we need to build, and that's the amount of answers. So in this case, we use AC to get the number of answers. And here we're just making a loop. So we start at 0. We're going to, as long as we're less than AC, that's going to make 3 or 4 questions. And what we're doing here is we're going to use Z. So Z, remember, is the object IDs. And for every object we build, we're going to take one of the object IDs, and then we're basically going to set that to false. So basically what we're doing here is we're going to add some data into our use state, which is going to both match the number of answers that are possible and also the ID of each answer. So let me just save that, and let's just go in now and use this console log here. And we're going to do the same thing again, answer. So this time, oh, sorry, we need to initialize. So this don't we? It's not just going to work. Okay, so what we can do here, let's just use a use effect, shall we? So what we need to do is we need to run this when the page loads up. So go ahead and import use effect up here. Let's just build this up. So we're going to use a use effect. So basically this is going to run the function here when the page loads. It's just going to run that once. So when the page loads, we just want to load this up. So what we want to do is we want to create an if statement. So if the object, the answer object, length is 0. So if there isn't any data inside of this object, then what we need to do is just populate it with our new data. So set answer is going to equal whatever's returned from create initial answer. So what we're going to need to do in the create initial answer, in actual fact, is just return the object. Okay, so remember we're creating a new object, putting all the data inside the object, and now we just want to return it. So let's see that in action. So what's going to happen now is that the page is going to load. It's going to run that function and then populate the state. And then we're going to be able to actually then see what's inside of it. Okay, so this doesn't necessarily follow React rules. So we're just going to put answer in here. So it works as we need it to. So if I refresh the page, boom, you can see here that we've automatically populated our object. And so what we've done here is we've created a new object, and it's ready now to be changed. So if the user only selects Django, that's great. What we can now do is compare this answer to the actual answer. So we've already got our 3 elements. Because like I said, if we don't select everything, then all that happens is we're just returning one answer, and it makes it harder for us to then compare against the actual answers. So there we go. So this should work as intended. So and so on. So when we go to the next answer, you can see here it's got false, false, false. If there were more answers, obviously there would be more options here. It's also got the ID of the question. So if I go on to question 2, we've got 4, 5, and 6. So that creates a good object for us to compare against the actual answers. So I guess the next thing that we need to do is to actually work out whether the user has selected the right answer. So let's go back into our button down here, and let's just put back the checking of the answer. So on click, so this button here, when we click this button on click, we want to run the check answer function. So let's go ahead and build this up. So we've got the, let's just move this up here. So we've got this function to handle select, this function to create some initial answers. And now what we can do then is build a new function here, which is going to check the answers. So let's go ahead and create a new function here. I've already done it. So that's for the check answer. So next thing that we want to do is we want to prepare the data that's being returned from our API. And we want to basically prepare the answers so we can then make a comparison between the answers, the real answers, and the user's answers. So let's just console.log. Let's just get this ready. And then A. So if you remember, A is the answers that's returned. That's the answers that we prepared earlier. So that's the real answers. So let's just have a look at these real answers. If I press submit, that should bring up the data. So the problem here is that that doesn't match what we need. Remember, the actual answers that we're saving is just the ID number and then just true or false. So we need to kind of make this data into a format that we can then compare against the user's answers. So let's go ahead and just extract, first of all. Let n equal. So this is going to be the answers. This is just going to return true or false. So we want to map this across. We want to map through. We want to skip through each item. So A is all the answers, remember. So what we want to do now is go through each answer, and we're just going to extract from it the object dot is right. So you remember we had a column called is right that stored true or false. So let's just get that data out. Now let's just console log that out so you can see what we're extracting. So if I were to now refresh, let's just submit the answer, and there we go. So now we have true, false, true. So that's the actual answers, true, false, true. So that should be true, that should be false, that should be false. So now what we need to do is add the IDs to it. So let's say let y equal, and this time we're going to say ... n. Okay, so I wonder what that does. So let's go have a look at now what y is. If I refresh, I shouldn't have to refresh, but I press submit. And now what I've got is 0, 1, and 2. Okay, that's useful. So now I've got an ID. That's pretty handy. But what you can see here is I've actually got the actual format I need now, so I can compare against the answer. So we can see that if we just add the console log y, refresh, and just submit, you can both now see the actual answers and the user's answers. So if I were to change here, something here, submit again, you can now see the user's answers down here have changed. They don't quite match the top here. So what we need to do now is match the values. What we're going to do is match the values in this scenario. I did mention earlier we've got the IDs, but I'm just going to show you how to match the values. So true must match true, false match, and so on. So that's going to determine whether we have the right answer or not. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to build a small function that basically checks. So we're going to build a function that checks two arrays to match the values in an array. So we're going to create a function here called array equals. We're going to take in two parameters, O and P in this case, and then we're going to return because it's a function. So we're going to check the array. So we're going to check to see if O is an array and then if P is an array. And then we're going to check the length to make sure that they're correct. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're going to check the values. So basically we're going to check the values of each of these arrays, and we're going to make a match to see if there is a match. Sorry, I just meant, I think you get the idea. I'm going to loop through every value in the array. I'm going to match to make sure there is a match between both arrays. Okay, so that's the function we're going to run. So now we just need to start up the function. So let's just put the data in place. So let O equals object values Y. So Y is the actual data. You can follow Y back here, for example, and this mapped to N. N was where we extracted is right. So anyway, so let's get that. That's the actual answers. And let's get the user's answers. Of course, that's stored in our data store as answers. Right, so now we've got the answers in place. Let's just now run the function. So it takes in two parameters here. So we run O and P. So we pass those into here, into this function. And then we just use an if statement. So if this is true, that means that if those values do match, then the console is going to log correct. Else it's going to console log incorrect. So let's see this in action. So let's go back and refresh. Right, so question 2, let's just check. Submit answer, incorrect. Incorrect? Still incorrect. And eventually we know that we select the right answer and it goes to correct. And there we go. So it looks like it's working okay. Let's just check the other answer. So Django, Flask, submit, incorrect. Just Django, correct. So that kind of adds, or that is all the functionality that we're going to set up just to set up a basic quiz. Now, this isn't necessarily the most optimal answer here, but hopefully that's given you an idea. If you run through this code, it gives you an idea about how to handle data and how to potentially delve into data, separate, slice data up, using maps to kind of iterate over data, and preparing the data in a way that then can be compared. Like I said previously, we'll loop back and we reiterate this code over the duration of this series or this course. But for now, we just got something in place so that we have a quiz, a working quiz. Anyway, so let's just finish this off by adding a new function. So let's go down into the random question here. So underneath the submit button, what we want to add is a new kind of component here, which we call, what can we call this? We would call this the result. So let's call this result. So obviously this is going to show the user whether they've selected the right answer or not. So let's just go up here. Let's just tidy this all up. Let's just add a new function here. So what we're going to do now is just create a simple function which is going to output. It's going to output an alert button, or it's going to output an alert title underneath. So it's going to tell the user whether they've actually selected the right answer or not. So it's not called app. It was called result. So let's just change that. Okay, so this is a result. So if answer check is equal to true, now answer check. So what we need to do in actual fact is set out a new state here. So what we want to do is just record whether the user has selected the right answer or not. So let's just create a new state here. So answer check and set answer check. So what we need to do is, apologies for scrolling up and down. If we go back into our if statement here, where we check whether it's correct or not, what we need to do is update the state whether the user has selected the right answer or not. So that's a simple case of just setting the state to correct. So we use a Boolean. So we'll say set answer true, obviously if it's true. And then what we'll do here is we'll also set the answer to false. Now the problem we've got here is that we're going to probably receive, oh no, we're not, no, that's fine. Okay, so there we go. So that sets that out. And so now what we have when the user answers the question, inside of answer checked state here, that's going to say true or false. So what we can now do is the result can appear if a condition is true. So if the answer check value is true, so if the user selects the answer and then the state then goes to true, is changed to true. If it does equal true, well, it's going to return this block here, which is going to be an alert. And you can see that that's going to give you a link here, which is going to then take you to the next question. Now, this is something a little bit hacky and I'm just utilizing for now. So what I'm going to do is just create a new function just above here, which is going to reload the page. So it's just going to refresh the page, right? So we'll deal with that at a later point. So that's when we click this button, it's just going to refresh the page. And that's going to show you another question, isn't it? So that's that in place. So this is the success alert. Then if check answer is equal to false, we're going to show this, and then else it's just going to return nothing at all. Right, so that's obviously the default. So that's basically going to show the alert button underneath the button if the answer is true or false, and that's obviously now connected down here in result. So let's just see that in action. There we go, wrong answer. And then just take the right answer. And there we go. So the right answer gives you this link. We can then go to the next question or the next random question and so on. Looks like it's working absolutely okay. And there we have it. So that was just some basic features and functionality for our quiz. It's just to say that we're using a quiz. Obviously, there's a few things that we need to change. Maybe you can build upon that if you want to do that individually. So I'll try and focus on Django. So in the next tutorial, we'll set up a user login system, which includes email confirmation as like it was requested from the community. So we'll do that next. We'll set that up so that users can log in. And then from then on, we can do lots of things. Obviously, we need to build the actual quiz so that we can run through an actual set of questions. That's something we need to do. So there's lots to do. Thank you for listening. It was a rather long one. If you did get this far, thank you very much. And hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.